Hello guys, and welcome back to this new video. Today we are going to talk about 8 mental illnesses that do not longer exist. So we do know that the history of categorizing and categorizations is very complicated. We do know that categories do depend on what Kuhn called paradigm, which changes at a certain point in time for every sort of science. And we do know that, it's very difficult to classify and categorize intermediate areas. Like, when would you define a man bald? If that man has one strand of hair, would you define it as a bald man? All of those questions are not what we're going to treat today. Today, instead, we are going to talk about 8 mental illnesses that do not longer exist for different reasons, okay? Some of them because they never were, and some of them because they have mutated, they have changed, they have thought to be a precursor of modern mental illnesses. So let's go ahead and let's start. Number 1 is lunacy. You know that nowadays we call somebody that has rapid mood swings as lunatic. A lunatic, somebody crazy, somebody who's not there, has mood swings and things like that, right? And that comes from the fact that in ancient times, the moon was thought to have an influence on our mind. And that is the reason why certain men assumed a sort of erratic behavior. And basically, the erratic behavior was the result of a bunch of sleepless nights. Nowadays, that has been associated with bipolar disorder, but most likely just because of the mood swings and the very high and the very low that you do have in a bipolar disorder. But I don't know if there's really a connection there between the two, but we do know that lunacy was a mental illness that nowadays does not exist anymore. Second, mental illness, something called vapors. So this is a term that we still have nowadays. And vapors was a disease that women suffered from. But not all women, because diseases are very selective. So women that were more independent, that were suffragettes, that were fighting to have more rights. That seems a totally fabricated disease, right? And if you're thinking that, you're probably right. Meaning fainting, fatigue, weakness. Those are very common symptoms for women, for men. Those are very common symptoms that could be ascribed to a bunch of different factors. So probably this was a totally made up disease to establish inferiority of women. Would this be the last one? No, I don't think so. Number 3. Dysesthesia ethiopica. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, if that is dysesthesia or dysesthesia, but what is the juice of it is that this was another totally made up, fabricated mental illness. Not that every mental illness was completely fabricated, but this one certainly was. It established the inferiority of black people because this was a disease, see the term Ethiopica, right? So coming from Ethiopia. And this was a disease that affected the black people that either had emancipated themselves or had been liberated from the state of slavery, right? That were thought basically to be very lazy people, sometimes suffering from fatigue, anxiety, sometimes from excessive drinking, but the cure was slavery. Why? Because they were unable to think for themselves, unable to make their own decisions, unable to guide and direct their lives the way they wanted to. So, number 4. Number 4 is male hysteria. Now, male hysteria is very interesting because, first of all, hysteria was born as a female sort of disease, an illness that would impact only women. And that was as we all know, a disease that was directly derived from sexual repression, right? Coming from the Victorian era, especially women were sexually repressed, that is, the Vulgate, that the illness was known for. And so they had symptoms, psychosomatic symptoms, that were exactly in relation to that. Now, from being a feminine sort of disease, like a disease that would impact females, hysteria became an illness that would impact males. Now, here it changes completely the tone, because it goes from you're sexually repressed to you're so sensitive, poor art, poor you, you know, sweetheart, and things like that. Meaning that many men, particularly sensitive, were thought to suffer from male hysteria. Now, there were poets, artists, so it was some sort of way of saying, oh, you're just very sensitive. There's nothing wrong with that, but the way the tone changes is, you know, self-explanatory and also a bit sexist. That's in my opinion, of course, but that's what I think. But anyway, so it goes to male hysteria, and then male hysteria changes into something dramatically different, initially known with the term of shell shock. That was basically the term for men experiencing a variety and a wide range of symptoms, but those men were coming from the First World War. And so you understand that this was gonna turn itself into a post-traumatic stress disorder, the way we call it nowadays. Shell shock is kind of the precursor terminology for it, and it's no longer just sensitivity, right? It is exposure to trauma and maladjustment to those experiences, to the trauma and the separation, death and threat also that has been experienced in the First and later on in the Second World War. Number 5. Homosexuality. Now, homosexuality was a sin in Christianity, but not really a crime. Let's go back for a second. Let's go back to ancient Egyptians. Now, we're not entirely sure, but homosexuality was in part allowed and admissible within that society. We certainly know that homosexuality was, though it took the form of pederastia more than homosexuality in ancient Greece, was actually present and part of the customs. We know that the ancient Romans were very free and open-minded, and certainly homosexuality was in that society, was not prohibited, was not even particularly hidden. And then we have Christianity. And what happens with Christianity is it's the turning on its head of those values, right? Everything that was just, fair, honorable, beautiful, and things like that became the opposite, and vice versa. So homosexuality, because of course there's no natural reproduction through homosexual acts, became a sin. It was a sin for the longest time ever, until something switched and it became actually a crime. Now, think about that at the time of Freud, so we are between the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. During the time of Freud himself was supporting the idea that men are in nature bisexual. So they're not heterosexual, they're not homosexual, they are bisexual. But then, of course, that became not very much compatible with the biopolitical move, because that is what it really was, the biopolitical move of turning homosexuality into a crime. We do know that Alan Turing, for instance, committed suicide not to undergo chemical castration because he was gay. And I'm not going to mention, but we do have, I think in general, a vague understanding of what homosexuals have gone through just for being themselves. So the idea here is that homosexuality was a sin, not a crime. It later on became a crime. We are again probably the very end of the 19th century, the very beginning of the 20th century, that became a crime. And then we took quite a long time to understand better homosexuality, because let me give you some stats here. In 1974, homosexuality was amended from the DSM, which is basically the manual to make diagnosis on mental illnesses. In 1980, the manual was talking about ego-dystonic homosexuality, which is like when you're not in line with your own perception in regard to whom you love. And in 1986, finally, he was completely removed by the so-called DSM. So we actually took, it's more than 80 years. It's certainly more than 80 years, right? By that, we also are neglecting in part what homosexuals started to go through probably from the 17th century onwards. So there's a long history there. Alright, next we go to dementia praecox. And this was a term invented in 1983 by Kraepelin. And basically, dementia praecox was different and made different by circular insanity. Now, circular insanity was more the umbrella term to describe a whole host of different mental illnesses, whereas dementia praecox was defined in terms of shun of the will and atrophia of emotions. And nowadays we use a different term for it, and the term is schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is not, in absolute terms, not treatable. It is a very difficult and complicated pathology to cure, for sure. And Westerners do have a hard time dealing with schizophrenia, more than other populations where hearing voices is more acceptable and less categorized as something terrible like we do. But anyway, let's then go to neurasthenia. Neurasthenia was another disease invented, or whose term was created in the second half of the 19th century by George Miller Beard. And neurasthenia was nothing else but a bunch of symptoms that derived from living in the city. So there was a lot more stress, and the rhythm, the pace of life was way more frenetic than what it used to be in the countryside. It was still probably is somewhat in the countryside, and so people had a form of real maladjustment to the city, and that is how the mental illness was described. So the cure was very simple: just go back to the countryside and kind of like live there rather than in the city if you cannot handle it. In 1835, Pritchard came up with a new term and a new disease. This time around, we are talking about moral insanity. Now, this is a disease that nowadays we don't have anymore. It belongs more to the sort of psychopathologists, more at the extreme, at the end of the spectrum, if you like. Moral insanity is the same charge or the same disease that Charles Gautier, the assassin of the American president James Garfield, was, I don't know if I should say accused of, or anyway was ascribed to him. And moral insanity was a total perversion of emotions, even though in terms that are purely intellectual, those people were completely fine. Finally, we have our last two obsolete mental illnesses. One is called inadequate personality disorder, and mostly it is centered around the idea of poor judgment. Now, of course, there are degrees to that. Simply depriving yourself, for instance, of sugar, since sugar it is stored in the frontal lobe, can cause you to be more irritable, to be more susceptible, to be more susceptible to comments, for instance, and be more reactive, and can cause you to be just more aggressive with people, for instance, right? So there are different degrees. You don't need a iron bar in your skull necessarily to get to the point of having some symptoms of dysregulation in terms of social emotions or social behavior. Finally, number 10 that we are going to talk about is gender identity disorder. Now, this was a category that grouped a bunch of different people, a bit randomly, I would say, right? Because think about that pedophiles were grouped in the same category of transgender, and it's not quite the same thing. But anyway, nowadays we don't have that. I think that the term was eliminated by the manual, the so-called DSM, in 2012. Nowadays we only talk about gender dysphoria, which is the correlated issue with feeling you are trapped in a body that is not yours, especially when you feel you're female and you're male, or vice versa. And so that is the term that we do use nowadays. I don't think we have society-wise accepted transgender. Certainly certain populations struggle more with that, and certain others struggle less, but there's a lot of prejudice and stigma that comes with that. And even though it's not anymore classified as a disease or pathology, there's a lot more that has to be done kind of like everywhere to come to terms with that, I guess, in societal terms. But with that being said, that's it, guys, because we're done for the day. So don't forget, of course, to comment below, let us know your thoughts. If you have enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. You can also hit the notification bell and receive our updates, and we'll talk some more next time. Bye!